Hi everybody, Mr. Z here. Today we are talking about the building blocks of life, and in particular we're going to talk about atoms, molecules, and compounds, or what makes you you. Our essential question today is what is matter, what is an atom and an element, and what do we call elements that are bonded together. So you should write this down in your guided note sheet, which is at the front of the room. If you don't have it, grab it now. You're going to take this guided note sheet and fill it in as we go along, and then paste it into your notebook at the end. That's going to get pasted onto page 6. So the first part should already be filled out for you. I got the title on there. What you're going to do is put in this essential question into the learning intention box. What is matter? What do we call elements bonded together? Why should you care? Well, the cells in your body require molecules for survival. If molecules never arose out of the primordial soup of our early Earth, we would have never evolved. We would have never had the earliest single-celled organisms, we would never have multicellular organisms, and we would not be here. Life would not exist without atoms, without molecules, and without compounds. So that's why you should care. So what is matter? If we were to take this flower here, and we pull the petal off of it, one of these white petals right here, and we tried to break it apart, and broke it in half again and again and again and again and again and again. Eventually, we would be unable to break it down any further. We'd be left with a tiny, tiny little piece of matter. And as we know, a flower is made out of matter. We are matter. Anything that has mass and takes up space is matter. And that tiny, tiny little piece of matter that would be left over after you broke this flower down as many times as you possibly could would be called an atom. It's a basic building block of life. And flowers are made out of atoms, and we are made out of atoms. So I want you to pause now and get these two definitions down. Matter is something that has mass and takes up space, and atoms are made out of matter and basic building blocks of life. Okay. So to emphasize this building block idea, we've got the wonderful analogy of Legos. We're going to say that Legos, or Lego bricks, the individual ones here, represent different atoms. And right now they really aren't doing anything, they're just laying about randomly, but they can stick together and we can put these Lego pieces together and build something like the Eiffel Tower out of them. Now it's similar to atoms because atoms can actually stick together, and when they stick together, we call that a bond. And when atoms bond together, they can also form more complex pieces of matter, such as the actual Eiffel Tower, which is way cooler than this Lego one. So again, here is what an atom might look like. In this case, it's helium. And if we took a bunch of different atoms and were able to bond them together, specific ones, probably not helium, maybe something more like iron, we would end up with something that looks like this. And I think it's way cooler than anything you can make out of Legos. It's the real Empire State Building right here. So this gigantic structure is made out of tiny, tiny, tiny little pieces of atoms that are bonded together. Okay? And we've looked at this periodic table before, and we learned that each square here represents a different type of atom. And these different type of atoms are the elements. An element is has specific characteristics, has a specific number of protons that its atoms are made with. So hydrogen, for example, has 1 proton and 1 electron, and it has certain properties that we associate with it. Carbon is another one we talked about at the beginning of the year. It has 6 protons, 6 electrons, and different properties from hydrogen. And we can go down the table, and you guys just did a project on the elements, so you should be familiar with all of this stuff right now. But just as a reminder, every atom looks something like this. It's got an electron shell, or electron orbitals, where our negatively charged electrons are. It's got a nucleus, where the protons, the positively charged particles, are. And it also has a neutron, or neutrons in it. In this case, we're looking at helium again. So it's 2 protons canceled out by our 2 electrons, and then we have 2 neutrons as well. All right, all of this should be reviewed from last quarter, so I don't want you guys to write this down, but it's just a reminder of what we have learned already. All right, now we get to the exciting stuff. Now we're talking about how atoms why we think of atoms as the building blocks, and it's because of bonds. Here we have oxygen just depicted as a plain old atom, and it's red, so we can think of this as sort of like the electron shell around it, like this big orange or yellowish shell here. Okay, it's just one oxygen atom. Here we have oxygen bonded to another oxygen atom, and in this case, you can see they're more like half circles. So this is what oxygen looks like when it's floating around in our air, actually. It's bonded with other oxygen atom, two oxygen atoms. We call it O2. And then we have oxygen bonded with two hydrogens. In this case, oxygen, the red one. Two white circles here represent hydrogen. So it's oxygen bonded with two hydrogens, and that makes water. So we have these simple elements bonding together to make something more complex like water. That's why atoms are the building blocks of life. Okay, so again, we've got, get myself out of the way here. We've got our oxygen that's in the air. It's actually just two oxygen atoms bonded together. And then water, which has all these unique and wonderful properties, is actually just one oxygen element, one oxygen atom bonded to two hydrogens. Okay, and then it's a whole bunch of those things together. That's what water is made out of. All right, now I have some more definitions for you guys. I want you guys to write these definitions down because they're important. We're going to be talking and referring to molecules and compounds throughout the rest of the quarter. So I want you guys to make sure you have a good understanding of what they are. We know that an element is a specific type of atom, which has a set of characteristics. We've learned about that already. The two new vocab words that we're talking about today are molecules and compounds. A molecule is going to be any two elements or more that are bonded together. So we just looked at oxygen bonded to another oxygen. That would be considered a molecule. We could have another thing. Let's take methane. Well, let's take CO2, for example. That's something you hear a lot about. CO2, we've got a carbon, C, and O2, meaning two oxygens. So we have a carbon bonded to two different oxygen atoms. That could also be a molecule. But then we also have this subset of molecules called compounds. And compounds are molecules, but it's a molecule that has at least two different kinds of elements within it. So all compounds are molecules, but not all molecules are compounds. Let's take a look at what that means. Here again, same pictures. We've got the oxygen single atom, a pure element. We've got oxygen as a molecule, where it's two atoms bonded together, but they're the same. And then we have a compound where it's two different elements bonded together, and in fact, three atoms altogether. So we have one oxygen, one hydrogen, and another hydrogen. Three atoms, but two different types of elements. So that's what makes this a compound. It's also a molecule, but compound is a more specific definition of what this substance is. All right, so using what we just learned, let's see if you guys can try to come up with the classification for each of these structures. You'll notice that each sphere, if it's a different color, that means it's a different type of element. We learned that if it's two or more elements bonded together, it's going to be a molecule. And if it's two or more different kinds of elements bonded together, then it's a compound. If we look at the first one, we're going to consider that a compound because it's two different kinds of elements. The middle one we'd call a molecule. It's not a compound because in this case we only have these red spheres, which in this case represent carbon. So this is actually, I think, 60 carbon atoms bonded together in a big sphere. It's called a buckyball. And then last but not least, this one, we have two nitrogen atoms bonded together, multiple atoms bonded together, but not multiple elements. It's a molecule. All right. So learning about all of these molecules is great because now we can start talking about chemical reactions. And our next unit is going to be called the processes of life, and we're going to talk all about different chemical reactions that happen in our cells. But for right now, I want you to get the basic of what a chemical reaction is. All the energy we obtain as humans comes from molecules and compounds breaking apart. When chemical bonds are broken or formed, the energy is either used or released, and we call that a chemical reaction. It's when bonds that are holding atoms together get broken. For example, cells get most of their energy by taking sugar and oxygen and turning it into carbon dioxide and water. We call this cellular respiration. So the bonds in that oxygen and sugar right here, in this sugar molecule, in this oxygen, right now they're bonded together. But what happens is they get broken apart, and when that happens, it releases energy, and our cells can use that energy. All right, and here's our last definition for today. It's going to be a mixture. A mixture is when two or more elements, compounds, or molecules are combined in any solution. So we think of a mixture like trail mix that I have here. Over here, I've got some oxygen, I've got some water, and I've got some nitrogen. This is also a mixture because it's got multiple different compounds and molecules in it, and they're all in the same solution. So that's what a mixture is. And again, I want you to write that definition down because we're going to be talking about that later as well. Okay, now what about the characteristics of life that we just learned about? Well, we learned about cells, we learned that everything that's alive is organized energy, it has to reproduce, it has to grow and develop, and it has to respond to stimuli. And right here I give you a list of reasons why all of these characteristics depend on atoms, molecules, and compounds. All right, so you can take a look at that. Life would not be possible without atoms, molecules, and compounds. That's the takeaway. Okay, so let's take one last little look here at our essential question. Said, what is matter? What is an atom and an element? And what do we call the elements that get bonded together? What are the different terms we have? So today's lesson was all about vocab. We learned about how anything that takes up space and has mass is matter. We've had that definition from last quarter, but it's a reminder. And matter can be organized into atoms, which are the building blocks of life. There are many different kinds of atoms, and their characteristics and structures make them unique. We call those elements. In the whole periodic table, there's 118 different elements out there. Each one of them is a specific type of atom with a specific number of protons. It has a specific characteristic and structure associated with it. Those elements then can be bonded together to form molecules and compounds. And when those molecules and compounds are combined into a solution, we might call them a mixture. All right, so those molecules and compounds can also be broken apart through chemical reactions. In a chemical reaction, it either requires or gives off energy, and it is required for us to survive. So the next part you're going to do, now that we've gone through all the slides, is you're going to find the processing assignment that I have at the front of the room. This is going to go on the left-hand side of your notes today, and you're going to answer those 4 questions. You can use these slides to refer to. You can also use online resources if you need, but I encourage you to ask a partner first. So go ahead and start working on your processing assignment that's at the front of the room, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.